People say the first few seconds decide everything. If you do not catch the audience immediately, you lose them. So let me begin this way. On the morning of my 35th birthday, I got laid off. Someone once asked me what poverty really feels like. I said, it feels like walking through a grocery store and choosing the discounted food that is about to expire because that is what you can afford. That is the emotional territory of the story I want to talk about today, not literally. This is not a novel about layoffs or grocery stores, but it is a novel about what it feels like when life loses its smooth surface, when the future stops feeling open, when memory becomes heavier than the present, and when love, instead of saving you cleanly, leaves you more confused than before. This is a novel about grief, desire, loneliness, and the strange, painful work of continuing to live when part of you no longer wants to move forward. What makes it so powerful is that it does not shout. It does not force emotion on you. It does not rely on dramatic speeches or easy moral lessons. It moves quietly and lets silence do the work. It lets small gestures carry enormous weight. A walk, a hand, a memory of grass moving in the wind, a room at night, a conversation that seems simple on the surface, but underneath it, an entire emotional world is collapsing. And that is why this story stays with people for so long, because real pain rarely arrives with clean explanations. Real pain usually enters a life softly. It hides in memory, in the body, and in the things we cannot say out loud. At the center of the story is a young man trying to make sense of loss. He is not a hero in the traditional sense. He is not brave in a cinematic way. He is simply young, sensitive, and emotionally unequipped for what life has already placed on his shoulders. Before he has even learned who he has already been marked by death. That early loss changes everything. It does not just make him sad, it rearranges the entire structure of his inner life. It shapes how he remembers people, how he approaches intimacy, how he understands guilt, and how he moves through ordinary days. Even when he seems calm, there is a quiet fracture inside him. And that fracture is where the novel begins to breathe, because the book is not really asking what happened. It is asking how you go on after something happens that changes the emotional climate of your life forever. And that question is much harder. A lot of stories about youth are built around discovery, first love, first heartbreak, first rebellion. But this story is different. It is not about youth as excitement. It is about youth as vulnerability. It is about being young and already carrying the kind of sorrow that should belong to someone much older. That is one reason the novel feels so devastating. It shows us that age does not protect anyone from emotional ruin. Sometimes the deepest confusion arrives before adulthood has even properly begun. And yet what makes the book unforgettable is not just its sadness, but the way it explores two very different forms of love. One form of love is quiet, fragile, and haunted. It is tied to memory, to guilt, to the dead, and to everything unresolved. It carries tenderness, but also helplessness. It makes you want to protect someone while knowing you cannot truly save them. It is beautiful, but also suffocating. The other form of love feels completely different. It is alive, impulsive, unpredictable, and full of energy. It brings back warmth, laughter, and movement. It reminds the protagonist that life is not made only of memory. That pain is real, but so is vitality. So is the possibility of joy appearing in the middle of emotional wreckage. And this is where the novel becomes something deeper. It is no longer just a story about love. It becomes a story about the tension between memory and life itself. Not simply choosing between two people, but choosing between two ways of being in the world. One way remains loyal to sorrow. It turns memory into a private shrine. It treats suffering almost as a form of devotion. It says that if you keep hurting, then what you lost must still matter. The other way is harder because it risks looking like betrayal. It says you can remember and still continue. That is an extraordinarily painful thing to learn. Many people never really learn it. They remain emotionally tied to an old wound. They mistake emotional paralysis for depth. They believe that moving forward means erasing what was sacred, so they stay stuck between past and present. This novel understands that state with terrifying precision. It understands what it means to love someone and still be unable to rescue them. It understands what it means to survive something and then feel guilty for surviving. It understands the strange cruelty of memory. Memory can preserve the texture of a moment, the sound of a voice, the feeling of a place, and yet fail to protect the person themselves. And most of all, the novel understands that grief is not only sadness. Grief is disorientation. It is the feeling that reality no longer fits correctly. It is waking up in the same world and realizing it has become slightly unreal. That feeling runs through the entire novel. Even in calm scenes, there is a sense that the characters are standing just slightly outside ordinary life, moving through routines while emotionally somewhere else. That emotional atmosphere is one of the book's greatest achievements. It captures something many adults understand. There are periods in life when you continue functioning on the outside, but internally you are moving through fog. You show up, you answer, you keep going, but inside you are still somewhere else. Maybe it was the end of a relationship. Maybe it was the death of someone you loved. Maybe it was a version of yourself you can never return to. Whatever it was, part of you never fully left. This novel is about that part, and that is why it still feels so modern. People often think a book becomes timeless because its setting fades, but sometimes it is the opposite. A book becomes timeless because its emotional questions remain unfinished, and the questions in this novel are still very much alive today. We live in an age of constant connection and deep loneliness. People are seen all the time, but rarely understood. They carry private sadness behind normal routines, and underneath everything many are still asking the same question: how do I keep living after something inside me has broken? That is the question of this novel. Not in a loud way, but in the body, in loneliness, in missed timing, in love that arrives too late. It shows that sincerity is not always enough, and that wanting to save someone is not the same as being able to save them. This is one of the hardest truths in the story. Love is real. Love matters. Love can transform a life. But love does not automatically heal a damaged mind. It does not reverse death. It does not guarantee that two people will meet at the right time in the right way. That is a brutal truth, but also a mature one. And this novel is full of that kind of maturity. It does not give easy hope, but it also does not collapse into despair. Instead, it shows that life is precious not because it is safe, but because it is fragile. It shows that love matters not because it always saves us, but because it reveals who we are. It shows that memory hurts not because it is weak, but because it is one of the few things we have against disappearance. There is also something deeply human in the way the novel portrays contradiction. People are never just one thing. They are tender and selfish, loving and distant, honest and evasive. They want connection, but fear being known. And that is what makes the story feel real. The protagonist himself is divided. He wants to remain loyal to what he lost, but also wants to keep living. He feels responsibility, desire, and guilt all at once. And that division is what gives the novel its emotional force. Because the real question is not who he loves more, it is what kind of life he is capable of choosing. Can he live inside memory forever, or can he move forward without feeling that he has betrayed the past? These are not just youthful questions, they are lifelong questions. That is why the book hits differently at different ages. When you are young, it feels like a sad love story. When you are older, it feels like a story about survival. It is about the cost of continuing in a world where nothing is guaranteed, where people disappear, where timing fails, where the heart has to learn to carry both memory and movement at the same time. One of the most haunting ideas in the novel is that death does not always end when it happens. Sometimes it remains inside the living. It shapes relationships, choices, and fears. But the novel also shows that life continues in stubborn ways. In laughter, in awkwardness, in warmth, in small acts of care, in the simple fact that someone still reaches out and asks to be seen. That is what keeps the story from becoming empty. It does not say that suffering is all there is. It says something harder, that suffering is real, and you still have to decide whether you will remain available to life. That decision is the true struggle at the center of the story. At some point, a person has to ask whether they will live entirely in the past or carry it and continue, whether they will let pain define them or deepen them, whether they will remain stuck or move forward even without certainty. This novel does not answer those questions neatly. It simply reveals them. It shows that becoming an adult is not about becoming invulnerable. It is about learning to live without illusions. You learn that people can disappear. You learn that love is not always enough. You learn that life does not pause while you understand it, and somehow you keep going. That is the quiet truth of the story. Not that it promises healing, but that it remains honest about how difficult healing is. So yes, it is a sad story, but it is also a story about endurance. About carrying loss without disappearing into it. About learning that life and grief can exist at the same time. About realizing that even after everything, you still have to choose to live. And that is where it leaves us. Do not rush away from sorrow, but do not build your entire life inside it. There is a difference between remembering and disappearing, between honoring love and surrendering your life to loss. Being 35 is not the end. It is a new beginning. Maybe not a clean one, maybe not the one you expected, but still a beginning. And sometimes that alone is something sacred.